Hello, everybody. If you are live with us tonight, it's great to see you. Let me just see if we are. I'm just going to check that we are on. Wouldn't want to talk for ages and you can't hear me. That would be awful. I'm here up in the college library, and around me is a group of illustrious students, as ever. Just a little notice. Not used to notices at this Bible study, but just so you know, if you're watching this live, as in you watch it every Tuesday night when it goes out, or at least you watch it every week. Next week there is no Acts. Yes, I know you're upset, but you just have to cope because we have a different event here at the college. Some of our Bible college students will be presenting their papers, and that's next Tuesday here. So there'll be no Acts. But we'll be back on the 17th of March. So you haven't got too long to wait. If you are watching this much later on, then none of that makes any difference to you. Okay, well, I want you to turn in your Bible, please, to Acts chapter 5. Welcome to lecture 18 of our series on the Acts of the Apostles. And I want to cover quite a bit of ground tonight. I want to do lots of these verses. I've already said how much I want to cover, and already people in the room have laughed at me, and they're probably right to do so. But last week, do you remember we killed off Ananias and Sapphira? Remember that? So Acts chapter 5 and verse 1, there they are. He lies, they keep back the money, or he keeps back part of the money. And they both are slain in the spirit. Nobody catches them, and they are buried. And they agreed to put the Lord to the test, and found out that's not a very good idea. Tonight, Acts 5, and just picking up in verse 11. So verse 10 is Sapphira has died and expired. That's in verse 10. And the young men come in and they take her out and bury her. And then it's verse 11 where we want to start this evening. And great fear came upon the whole church and all who heard of these things. Now, many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles, and they were all together in Solomon's portico, Solomon's colonnade, Solomon's porch. And here's an interesting piece that we'll investigate in a minute. Look, none of the rest dared join them, but the people held them in high esteem, and more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women. So we'll mention that in a minute. How is it that no one else dared join them, but more than ever, people were added? Multitudes of both men and women, verse 15, so that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats, that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. The people also gathered from the towns around Jerusalem, bringing the sick and those afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all healed. But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that's the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison. Or some versions, they put them in prison publicly. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out, and said, "Go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life." When they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. Now, when the high priest came and those who were with him, they called together the council, all the senate of the people of Israel, and sent to the prison to have them brought. But when the officers came, they didn't find them in the prison. So they returned and reported, "We found the prison securely locked, and the guards standing at the doors. But when we opened them, we found no one inside." Now, when the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard these words, they were greatly perplexed about them, wondering what this would come to. Or if you like, wondering what had happened, what was going on. Verse 25, and someone, not named, look, someone came and told them, "Look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people." Then the captain with the officers went and brought them, but not by force, for they were afraid of being stoned by the people. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them. Okay. So just come back to verse 11. Here's a word. This is how we finished last time. You may or may not remember. Luke introduces a new word that he hasn't used before, and it's the word church. There it is, sitting there gloriously in verse 11. Great fear came upon the whole church. Luke has not mentioned this word until now. And it's interesting. So the word is ecclesia. Ecclesia was a word that Greeks used just to mean like an assembly of people. So many of us are old enough to remember going to school and having school assembly. So the word ecclesia really just means assembly. It's a gathering of people. So if you were in a Greek city and all the citizens gathered, that would be an ecclesia. A group of people gathering together would be an ecclesia. It is an assembly, which we now have the word church. So it's quite interesting. It means that it'd be tricky for you to say, well, I don't gather with other Christians, but I'm in the church, because the actual word means to assemble with others. I won't push that too much, but that is quite interesting, especially in days when people get a lot of their ministry online, you know. We mustn't forsake the physical gathering of ourselves together, must we? So the word church will appear 23 times, I think, in Acts, but it appears first here. What's more interesting for us, and I hope you'll be excited by this, is that this word connects the Old Testament with the New in a really special way. Because while the Greek word ecclesia meant to gather together, the word ecclesia was used when the Old Testament was translated into Greek. A book called the Septuagint, and some of you will know this will be new to others. The Hebrew word, I'm probably going to butcher its pronunciation now, but kahal, meaning a gathering together of people, was translated as ecclesia. So, for example, this happened when the Lord appeared and gave the people the 10 Commandments. So that day was called the Day of Assembly, or if you like, the day of the church, the day of the ecclesia. It just means the gathering together. But because it's in the Old Testament, it doesn't just mean a group of citizens, it means God's people. Let me read you some texts. This is in Deuteronomy 9 and verse 10. Just coming to my notes now, it says, "And the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone," this is Moses, isn't it? "Written with the finger of God. And on them were all the words that the Lord had spoken with you on the mountain out of the midst of the fire on the day of the assembly." Deuteronomy 18:16 says this, "Just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly," when you said, "Let us not, hear the Lord's voice anymore." And then later on in Deuteronomy 31:30, Moses spoke the words of this song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly, the ecclesia of Israel. What's the point that I'm sort of trying to make with this? Is that once again, the Old Testament and the New Testament are not two stories. They are two sets of libraries in the same story. So the people of God in the Old Testament were called the assembly, or they were called the ecclesia. And in the New Testament, they're called the ecclesia. So for Luke, using that word, deliberately, and also Paul and the other New Testament writers, they're making a direct sort of, connection. So rather than saying, well, first it was the Jews and now it's the church or something like that, these are the same people. It's the people of God. So it isn't a sense that the church has replaced Israel, because Israel were the church in the Old Testament. And now the church is bigger, yes, in the new. Now the Gentiles are much more obviously grafted in. But I find that just a very exciting element to this. We are part of God's people. You who watch me and are here in the room up in the library at Mattersey with me tonight, we're part of God's people that have always been. So Moses and Aaron were part of the church, and anyone that gathered together to hear God's voice were, the ecclesia. They were the church. If you have the ability just to flick in your Bible to Acts 7 and verse 38, this is made really explicit. Now, I won't turn to it on my screen here just so I don't mess up all the technology. But in Acts 7 and verse 38, Stephen is preaching, and he talks about, now you'll have different versions, but he talks about the ecclesia, or the church in the wilderness, or you might have the assembly or something like that. And so there, as Stephen is preaching a bit later on in Acts, he actually sort of uses the word that we would say church, meaning that the church, so the church has always sort of existed. That's, as much as God's been gathering his people together, that has been the ecclesia. And look, as we see, so just coming back to Acts 5 and 11, great fear came upon the whole church. Mentioned this at the end of last time, that if it came upon the whole church and upon all who heard these things, it means that the events of the death of this couple went way beyond the room. So people found out about it. It came upon the whole church, which also is indicative of its growing size, and all who heard these things. So the whole point of mentioning this and making a point of verse 11, a lot of the scholars believe that the reason why Luke has, that's this just speculating, so take this with a pinch of salt really, but some have speculated the reason why Luke has not used the word church until this time is because this is such a big moment. So because of the demonstration of the power of God, the death of these two people. You may remember we talked last time about how there was a judgment in the Old Testament, and which sets up the sort of like the people of God, which was Achan. You may remember. If not, have a look at that video. And now we have the judgment on these two. So you get this sense of God doing something new. So maybe that's why Luke has held back the word and uses it now. David Peterson, a scholar that I've been reading, he says this: God has unmistakably shown that this community of people are his own. Right? So it's that sense of, you lie to the Holy Spirit, you die. These are we're not mucking about. It's not just a religious group here. These are my people. So God has shown these people are his own. Here's what Peterson says: the new Israel in the midst of the old. And as a result of that, no one wants to join them. right? Great fear comes upon, and no one else. Look at verse 13. None of the rest dared join them. It's not a great evangelistic strategy, is it? To make people terrified to join you. A lot of people say, well, if there's signs and wonders, the churches will be packed. Don't know about that. Don't know about that. Look, what kind of signs and wonders do we mean? So people were afraid to have anything to do with it because God was powerfully in their midst. There are lots of reasons, I think, why people don't want to come to church today, of course, and we can lament that, but probably that it's too supernatural is probably not the main reason, is it? So we need to get back to a little bit of this, I think. Anyway, the signs and wonders continue. Look at verse 12. Many signs and wonders. I don't know what the NIV has, but here in the ESV, regularly done, which sort of reflects the sense of the Greek that this was going on and on and on. Just something for you to notice. Look, by the hands of the apostles. So these things were done by the hands of the apostles. Later on in Acts, so just to give you the contrast, later on, who's going to do miracles? Philip the evangelist is going to do some miracles. Stephen's going to do signs and wonders. Ananias is going to pray for Paul, and he's going to be able to see again. So there will be others. Arguably, Luke prays for the sick in Acts 28. So there will be others that will work signs and wonders, but just so you just notice, can you see how apostle heavy all this is? The signs and wonders weren't just being done by everybody, they were being done by the hands of the apostles. I just think it's kind of sort of interesting. Among the people, you might remember, we've said this in most lectures, verse 12, among the people meaning the people of Israel, so meaning the Jews in Jerusalem. Regularly done. I wonder what you make of this line, by the hands of the apostles, meaning, do you think that is literal? So, or is it a sort of a Semitic expression, a Hebraic expression? This was the work of their hands, which might not necessarily mean it was done by their actual hands, right? So, just to give you an example, in Acts 19, it will mention that God did extraordinary things through the hands of Paul, but then it will mention handkerchiefs that were nothing to do with his hands, that were healing the sick, but it was still done through his hands. So it, of course, it most likely means that they laid their hands on people, right? That's how we would normally see it, but just to reflect, it may not necessarily mean that. Last week, or last time, depending on when you're watching this, we noted that the feet of the apostles were being referenced. Remember that? They laid stuff at the apostles' feet. Now we've moved from feet to hands. So now it's the hands of the apostles that are active. Just find that sort of quite interesting. When Yahweh, the God of Israel, when he stretched out his hand, it's because Moses and Aaron stretched out their hands, right? So that's so that was in the case of the sea turning to blood. So I think it's Aaron who actually does that. Stretch out your hand, and then God stretches out his hand. So this whole thing about hands is quite interesting. When the Red Sea opens, it's because Moses he raises his hand, he stretches out his hand, and the Red Sea parts, and then he stretches it out again, and it shuts up and kills them all. It kills the Egyptians going through it. So kind of interesting. Acts 14 verse 3 is another sort of link into this thing about the apostles' hands. It says this, they remained for a long time. This is Barnabas and Paul now, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. That's Acts 14 and verse 3. And yet, a little bit later in Acts 14, verse 10, just a few verses later, Paul sees a lame man in Lystra and sees he's got faith to be healed and says, "Stand upon your feet." He doesn't use his hands at all. So it could just be that it's a sort of an expression. They were all together. Look at verse 12, the middle of verse 12, or 12b, if you like, second half. They were all together in Solomon's portico. We've already said that's an area in the temple that could potentially have housed thousands of people. And this little thing, if you're a classical Pentecostal or you have the King James Version or whatever, that whole thing about they were all in one accord. So we get that all in one accord word here again, which ironically doesn't feature in Acts chapter 2 verse 1, but everyone sort of quotes it as though it does. So they were all with one accord together. And no one dared join them. The people held them in high esteem. That's interesting because the Sanhedrin haven't held them in high esteem. They've threatened them. But the people, right? So that's the people of Israel. That's the Jerusalemites, are holding them in very high esteem. So let's just tackle this really interesting tension here. And I don't want to make too much of it, but I find it interesting. So no one joins them, right? Excuse me, verse 13. No one else joins them. And more than ever, believers were added to the Lord. So this is sort of interesting. And it all depends on how we translate the word join here, which is a little Greek word, kolao, which can mean to join, or it can mean to approach. So if you read it slightly differently, it might make a bit more sense if we were to translate this approach, i.e., no one else dared approach them, but more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, so that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats, that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on them. So can you see that if we connect that verse there to what we just read, it might mean they realized that God's power was at work among the apostles, but they were frightened to come near them because Ananias and Sapphira were toast and buried. And so then they, rather than bring the sick to Solomon's colonnade, everyone getting where I'm going? They laid them in the street because that was felt safe enough to not be near them. And I think that's what this means. Now, there are other ways to read this. It might mean that no one else dared to join them, but that was only temporary. Some have offered, even in verse 13, none of the rest dared join them, means that Christians stopped meeting with them because maybe they thought they're going to be the next Ananias and Sapphira. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can read this verse. But I think it means that people are very nervous because there'd been these deaths, there'd been this high drama. And so rather than bring the sick into the temple courts, they laid them on the streets outside, so that when Peter was traveling from wherever he was staying or whatever he was doing, then maybe they would get healed as he walked by. So I think that's sort of what is going on there. Notice, by the way, Luke's a big fan of those on the margins, and in this case, that's going to be women here. So look at this. More than ever, 14, believers were added to the Lord. Multitudes of both men and women. There's no reason for Luke to write women, except that he wants to emphasize this, and he does it all the time. And of course, it fulfills Joel's prophecy on my, on my men and women, on my male servants and my handmaidens or my female servants. I will pour out my spirit in those days. And so, yeah, anyway, just notice Luke's little reference there to the women that were being added to that number. The streets, so they've carried these mats and beds. By the way, don't think of a cot as necessarily having a baby in it, please. I mean, maybe there were children there, but that's not quite what the word cot means there. So that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. Now, that is a really interesting construction in Greek as well, because fall on some of them is an aorist, which sort of implies that the shadow fell on them one at a time, which is sort of quite interesting. However, even just reading it as is, can you see that it doesn't actually say that Peter's shadow healed any of them? If you look at it carefully, they had it in their head, didn't they? They had it in their head that if Peter's shadow came over them, they would be healed. And Luke intends us, I'm sure the author's intention here is that this was an amazing, miraculous event. And wherever Peter walked, these people were healed. But in terms of the actual science of that, so to suggest that if his shadow didn't quite actually hit you, you didn't get better. I mean, that's magic, isn't it? That's a bit more Harry Potter than the Bible. So that was it was Peter's proximity that was healing them, not his actual shadow, of course. I noted, by the way, is it Platea? Where is it? Oh, yes. The word streets in verse 15 is just a particular word. I forget which commentator took me to this, but it means wide streets. So we're not talking about like little side alleyways, but we're talking about the big, wide streets. Yeah, which of course makes sense to put beds on and cots and mats and all of this, and to gather the sick like that. It would have to be a very wide pavement, wouldn't it, rather than a little sort of a little side tunnel, through some small part of Jerusalem. Yeah, so it was a big, big event. In the Greek world, if in Hellenistic culture, just to quote a scholar, Johnson, he says that to be touched by a man's shadow would mean to be in contact with his soul or his essence and be influenced by that, whether that was good or bad. There's no sense that these Greeks, these Greek ideas are influencing these Jews. They're more likely thinking about, he who dwells in the shadow of the Most High. Psalm 91. I also noted Psalm 57, verse 1. Have mercy on me, my God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until disaster has passed. If you're making notes, that's Psalm 57 and verse 1. So a first century Jew might have even thought about when the Lord overshadowed the tabernacle as well. So the sort of the Greek idea that Peter is the one doing the healing just doesn't fit with either their views at the time or even the views of the rest of the New Testament. Yeah, so the shadow is falling. Look at this though. Look where the people are from. Look at verse 16. The people also gathered from the towns around Jerusalem. Now that is a line that when you're reading this in a Bible reading plan, you just read that. Yeah, yes, okay. So the people gathered from the towns around Jerusalem. But this is the first time the gospel has gone to the towns around Jerusalem. Before it's all been inside Jerusalem, right? Bringing the sick. So this means Judea. And if you're an Acts fan, you might know Acts 1:8. You will receive power and the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and then in all Judea. So the prophecy of Acts 1:8 is beginning to come to pass a little bit more as people from the Judean countryside, that's what we mean, the towns around Jerusalem, bringing the sick and those afflicted with unclean spirits. You see, they're two different things there. They're not the same thing. And they were all healed. I think I said it at the end of last time, but let's not miss that. They were all healed. My goodness me. What a thing. He didn't lay hands on them. I'm not even sure he would have even prayed for them. I think he just walked by, didn't he? I mean, we don't know, but it's just his shadow. They're frightened to go near him, especially if my theory is right, that they're a bit nervous of the Ananias and Sapphira factor. And is it the new believers, by the way, that are bringing the people? So look at verse 14. More than ever, believers were added to the Lord. So then look at 15. So that they even carried out the sick into the streets, as though it was the newbies that did this. It depends how you read that. They might be the people of Jerusalem. So, but just a simple reading of it might suggest that it was the new converts who then went and found maybe members of their family or whatever that were living in the outskirts of Jerusalem, or maybe they did, and in the towns of Judea, and they brought their relatives or friends or something like that. So it seems like it's the new believer. This is all very preachable, this, isn't it? But it was the new believers that got involved in this wonderful work of mission. And they were all healed. It reminds me, I'll read a little bit of Mark's Gospel, chapter 6. It says this: they ran throughout that whole region. So this is Jesus' ministry, Mark 6, 55 to 56. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed those who were ill in the marketplaces. So again, it's a similar sort of story. They put them in the streets. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. And they were all, verse 16, they were all healed. I know Acts is an exciting book and there's a long way to go, but this might be one of the most exciting parts of the whole book, right here. They were all healed. Now, if you're going to have healings in the street, where people are coming from all around, guess what's going to happen? The high priest and his entourage aren't going to be very happy. So now we pick up in verse 17. The NIV is a little bit soft here, because I think the NIV just says, then the high priest did something. But this is a little bit soft, say some of the commentators, and I sort of see what they mean. He takes action. In fact, it literally says he rose up. That's what I've got in my ESV. He rose up. You might remember when Ananias and Sapphira died, the young men rose up to bury them. So it's an expression, doesn't mean they were sitting down, but it means they sprung into action. So in the same way, the high priest, which is probably Annas, sprung into action. And those who were with him, the Sadducees, and look at this, filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles. It's not a good look, is it? It's not a good look for them. The Greek word here sometimes can be translated, zealous, zeal. But here, it's obvious to me that Luke is not meaning that they were zealous in sort of a good way, but they were jealous in a sinful way. And he will mention this again. So in Acts 13, verse 45, a bit later on, it says, when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. They began to contradict what Paul was saying. And then Acts 17, verse 5, much further on into the book, in the city of Thessalonica, says this: but other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. So this is a very, negative thing. So the Greek word for zeal is zelos. Sometimes zeal's a good thing, but here it clearly isn't. It's a negative thing. So the high priest rose up and was filled with jealousy. You might remember that Luke has a theme running through Acts, and that is a theme of fullness. So the disciples are filled with the Spirit, yes, the end of Acts 4. And then in Acts 5, Satan fills the heart of Ananias. And now the high priest and those with him are filled with jealousy. So it's all very preachable, this, but whatever fills you, according to Charles Price, I love this little quote, heard it years ago, dominates your personality and determines your behavior. Whatever's filling you is dominating your personality and determining your behavior, albeit maybe temporarily. And so here, their personality is and their behavior is sinful. So they arrest the apostles and they put them in the public prison. Now, whether the word public is new there, so you might remember they had arrested them before. They arrested them after the healing of the lame man, and this might be the same prison, or the use of the word public might mean it was a different place. So it's possible that in the temple they might have had like a little sort of mini jail, and this is now the bigger one or something like that. Because look at verse 18, when it says they arrested the apostles, who do you think it means? So before it was Peter and John, but now I want to suggest to you that it's many more than that. If you come down to now, where are we? Where they are brought in, it mentions Peter and the apostles. So it's more than just Peter and John. Anyway, we'll get to that in just a moment. So they put them in prison. So they arrest them publicly. Notice a little bit of irony here in the text. The angel comes during the night. So if you like, the angel comes privately while they were arrested publicly. Now there's a bit more to this story than maybe you think. What on earth is going on here? Why do I think this is interesting? Well, look, during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out. Now, come down to the report. Verse 22. So I've not missed that other bit out. We'll go back to it. But look, when the officers came, they didn't find him in the prison. So they returned and reported, we found the prison securely locked. So here's something fun. The angel opened the door and then he locked it. Right? That's true, right? Mm. So he opens the door in verse 19, but being a good, citizen, he leaves it the way he finds it and he locks it. But look, we found the prison securely locked. And look at verse 23, and the guards standing at the doors. Right? But when we opened them, we found no one inside. So there's a bit more to this. There were guards standing outside. Yes? And the angel came, opened the door, and they didn't see. They didn't know it happened. We're not told, they were asleep. They're not told they'd gone off for a falafel. They didn't see it. So it's a bit more amazing than you think. It's not just the angels said, all right, lads, I'll open the door quick before anyone sees. That whole corridor could have been full of guards and no one would have seen. Something really amazing happens here. Do you get that? It's sort of fun, isn't it? So the guards were still there and they've gone. It's like it's like a big magic trick. Where are they? We definitely put them in there. Who let them out? We didn't see, we didn't experience anything, nothing happened. And yet they're gone. So I find this all really, really fun to think about. So just a few things. The angel of the Lord. Well, perhaps I should be more precise. An angel of the Lord. Some commentators do like to make a link to the angel of the Lord. So even though the definite article, which is the, is not there in the Greek, you don't necessarily need it. And so some have said, well, just the use of that phrase, angel of the Lord, like he's a big character in the Old Testament. And I know people have liked to turn him into Christ and stuff like this, but just laying that to one side for a moment. This could be that same character. It's like a major character, and now he's with the apostles, right? Rather than with characters in the Old Testament, he's now with them. I love this as well. He escorts them out. Where does it say that? He opened the doors and he brought them out. He brought them out. I think that's worth mentioning too, because that's an expression that was used in the Exodus, wasn't it? Right, that God brought his people out of Egypt. So even just the use of that language, it's all big. These are all big terms, meaning these are the people of God. So God brought his people out of Egypt. God's bringing his people out of this jail. So again, a Jewish first century audience hearing this story would absolutely connect all those dots and see the most significant part to it. So he did indeed bring them out. The language of Exodus 6 and verse 7. The God who led out the Israelites is with the apostles now. Exodus 6 and verse 7 says this: I will take you as my own people, I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's the same word that's used here. Yeah, so there's definitely a connection. And then we get these officers. Where are they? Oh yeah, look at verse 22. The officers came. Sometimes people have preached about John Mark in Acts 13, where there's a word used for him, which is the word under rower, which is, if you've ever seen like an old movie or whatever, like a Roman, like Gladiator 2 had a scene at the beginning, I think, where all these people are in a boat rowing and they're under the ship. So it just means a servant character. So John Mark will be called this later as he serves Barnabas and Saul. So it's a kind of a servant role. These officers were normally a group of priests or Levites. They're normally involved in security at the temple. So the word officer works quite well because it's got that sense of law enforcement, which is what this is about. They were supposed to do with night security. So they go, they find that the angel has relocked the doors. And this does, of course, happen again. So in Acts 12, Peter will be imprisoned again, and Peter will be rescued by an angel again. Later, in that instance, Peter is chained to 2 sentries. Now, we'll get to that eventually, possibly the next century, but we will eventually get there. So Peter's chained to these 2 sentries, and yet he walks away from them. So we've got this same sort of phenomena of God being able to, I don't know what the word would be, confuse, blind, Angels in Sodom did indeed blind uh, some of the citizens of Sodom in order to protect Lot, and uh, and God struck blind the Arameans in the days of Elisha. This is just after Elisha prayed that his servant would see the hosts of heaven all around them, and then later in the next section, the Arameans are struck blind, perhaps possibly by the angel. So there is. By the way, I'm not necessarily making a case that they were blinded. I think it's more bewildering than that. Um, uh, but anyway, nevertheless, there is sort of a little bit of Bible for this, where people can't see temporarily because of an act of an angel. You might remember the man of God in Luke 1 who can't talk because an angel stops him. So, yeah, who knows what's gone on here? But this is a bit more supernatural than you think. The angel has not just opened the door, he's completely stopped anyone seeing it, knowing about it. They've walked out as though, as though they were invisible men or something like that. Anyway, who knows? Answers on a postcard about that. And they were amazed. They were amazed. What's the word being used here? They were astounded. Oh, it's here. Just come down to verse 24. They were greatly astounded, is that? Greatly perplexed, right? They were greatly perplexed. What have you got in the NIV, somebody? Anyone got an NIV? They were greatly perplexed. Okay. Now, this is the word, same word, used on the day of Pentecost, when the people began to speak in tongues and the people were amazed, saying, oh, what meaneth this? So it's the same word. So it's a strong word, meaning, what happened there? Where did our prisoners go? Now, here's the thing. The angel releases them, right? So just to jump back up to verse 20. And he says this, go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life. So why does the angel release them? So they can carry on being missionaries. Right? So they're not sent home for like a cup of tea and a hot water bottle and maybe a sandwich because they've had an awful day. I think they do, by the way, go and rest, because it says they go at daybreak. Look at that in verse 21. When they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. Why at daybreak? Because that's when the gate opened. So there was an early morning sacrifice. So actually, this is all very preachable. It's all very, very interesting. They obeyed as soon as they could. Can you see that? So they didn't have a day to sort of like recover and pray about it. As soon as it was daybreak, they went and did it, right? So they went off and got some sleep, did they? I don't know. I don't know what they did. But as soon as it was dawn and the gates to the temple were open, they obeyed immediately. And they go and do verbatim what the angel told them to do. Go and stand in the temple. So that's, by the way, in verse 20, that's probably the temple courts. So rather than the inner temple, we're talking about the campus of the temple, very large area. And so they're probably out in those temple courts preaching to the people. The very thing that of course, the high priest and Sanhedrin said that they should not do. But they've gone as soon as they have been able to do so, because the angel wants to guide them to preach the gospel. And I just made a couple of notes that this happens again in Acts. So these are patterns that you see as you read Acts. So, for example, most people know the story of, or will have heard the story of Philip preaching to the Ethiopian eunuch. That's in Acts 8. In verse 26, we're told that an angel guided him to do that. So that's kind of interesting all by itself. It's an angel in Acts chapter 10, verses 3 to 7, that appears to Cornelius and says, send for Peter. I always find it interesting. The angel can't preach the gospel to Cornelius, but he can urge him to send for a preacher to come to him. So the angels are involved in the preaching of the gospel. Peter is then released, which we mentioned, to get back to preaching the gospel. Many scholars believe that when the earthquake shakes and Paul and Silas's chains fall off, because angels were involved in all the other prison breaks in Acts, the likelihood is that we're supposed to think, you wouldn't die on this hill, but the likelihood is you're supposed to think that an angel has shaken that prison and released them in order to go and preach the gospel. And then finally, when Paul is in his storm at sea, an angel appears to him on the ship to comfort him, but he gives him this message: you will survive this storm, Paul, because you must stand before Caesar. So it's just kind of interesting that angelic activity of this kind was to move and motivate Christians to share the gospel with the lost, rather than for, charismatic entertainments, and interesting and miracles and phenomena. Wonderful though all those things can be. I've had angelic assistance in my own life that I've shared many, many times in many places. Physical activity. But it's not something that should be thought to happen every day. And so for me, this was, over 20 years ago. But here you see angels involved with the people of God in order to help them to mission, to bring them into mission, rather than to do anything else for them. And they go to the temple. David Peterson says this: they were to take their stand at the very center of Israel's national and religious life. So again, it's the most controversial place you can go, but there they go. And then you get this guy who says, hang on a minute, and he's sort of unnamed, isn't he? Someone came, I'm in verse 25, so they can't find them. And someone came and told them, look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. And then the captain with the officers, that's those under rowers again, went and brought them, but not by force, for they were afraid of being stoned by the people. The commentator Bock says this: the people respect the apostles and don't see them as religious criminals, even if they don't believe them fully. And they simply bring them. So there isn't a riot. So I'm in verse 27. There isn't a big issue. They yield over. And this is sort of interesting because you might remember that not so many weeks further back from this story, Peter had chopped a man's ear off rather than surrender to guards. But here he willingly comes. And you can see they've been, that was that verse I was looking for. Look at verse 29. Peter and the apostles answered. So it's not just Peter and John anymore. There's a whole crowd of them involved in this. So when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. I think you might get into trouble for saying this. Then there's going to be a cameo, like who you wouldn't have expected, character called Gamaliel will appear in verse 34, a Pharisee who's going to offer wisdom to this group. But no, these apostles are going to be interrogated yet again. But that is a conversation we'll probably need to have next time. So if you've been watching us online, thank you. You've made it through to the end of our lecture. Again, if you are watching us live, just a little reminder, there's no class next week, but we will return on the 17th of March. So please like and subscribe. I think that's the cool thing to say, isn't it? I'm really down with the kids now. Like and subscribe, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.